And it goes a little something like this. Bulls can cut it to one if they score. Here's Jordan in the middle all the way.
Yeah, that's great. The crowd went absolutely bonkers. He's so fired up. I guess the adrenaline's flowing. He's such an incredible athlete. All those sort of things combine to make him just that freakish 1 in a billion athlete.
I always like to say that Michael got to play with me for a year at North Carolina. I think it really helped him.
Spectacular player from the beginning.
You can see right away Jordan was going to be a big-time scorer.
And showed what an impact he was going to have on the league.
This is NB85, celebrating the 30-year anniversary of Michael Jordan's rookie season in the NBA. And now, your hosts, Adam Ryan and Aaron Steen.
Welcome back to another episode of NB85. We're up to episode 11. Thank you again for joining me. Aaron, how are you today, mate?
Adam, I'm very well, thank you.
If you're a new listener to the show, thanks for joining us. If you're one of our regular listeners, welcome back. Since episode 10 was published, mate, we've received a fantastic review from a very kind listener of the show, Fexy23. A really great review. It's titled Best Basketball Podcast Out There and 5 stars. Thank you very much, Fexy. It says, for anyone who grew up in the late 80s and early 90s and loved NBA basketball during the MJ years, this is a must listen. It is an entertaining, well-researched, ridiculously in-depth podcast. I'm loving both the special guest episodes and the 84-85 season recaps. Great work, guys. Now, fantastic stuff. Thank you very much, Fexy. I'm sure you echo those sentiments, mate.
Comments like these make me feel a lot better about the fact that I threw away the last 2 years of my high schooling obsessing over the NBA.
I'm right there with you. I lost track of the number of times that I actually zoned out in class and was concentrating on doing win-loss records on the back of my wooden ruler as I scoured through clippings from newspapers. Anyone that goes out of their way to add a review via iTunes or Stitcher, wherever it may be, I can't thank you enough. It really does add to the enjoyment that we take from creating this series. There are a few other great podcast reviews that have been received since the last episode of the In All Airness podcast, separate to this NB85 series, which I will mention in episode 50 of that podcast when I release the next episode. So thank you again to those that contributed those reviews too.
San Antonio versus Chicago, November 13th, 1984.
This time it was in front of a crowd of 9,866 people at the Chicago Stadium. Now the Bulls entered this game 6-2 on the season. The Bulls are coached by Kevin Lockery. The Spurs were led by a name familiar to most listeners of the show, Cotton Fitzsimmons. Now the TV coverage for this game, mate, is Bulls TV, and the commentators were Bill Hazen and the late, great Johnny Reed Kerr. The Spurs entered this game also with a 6-2 record. That's on the back of improved bench production from players including future Bull John Paxson and Alvin Robertson. And a quick fact about Alvin Robertson, mate, he was probably one of the more overlooked players from that 1984 NBA draft class. He was the number 7 pick overall. And in our second episode of this series, inalanis.com/NB85-2, we actually broke down the 84 NBA draft and also chatted about it in full as well in episode 25 of the In All Airness podcast, which is inalanis.com/25.
Yeah, he's one of those guys from the top 10 in that draft who definitely went on and had a very good career, was a multiple-time All-Star and NBA Defensive Player of the Year winner.
There's an interesting mix of players who are on each of these rosters. The Spurs were spearheaded by future Hall of Famers Artis Gilmore and George Gervin. Artis Gilmore had 6 straight seasons with the Bulls from 77 through to 1982. And then in 1988, he briefly played with the Bulls for 24 games. And the Iceman, George Gervin, he finished his illustrious career as a Chicago Bull in 1986 season. And he averaged 16 points a game in 25 minutes per contest. John Paxson, he signed with the Bulls as a free agent in late October of 85. I found it interesting that he only averaged, I use only in inverted commas, he only averaged double figures in points in 2 NBA seasons, which was quite surprising, in 1987 and 1990. Johnny Moore is an interesting character who's on the Spurs roster. He played 9 seasons with San Antonio, and he led the league in assists in 1982. He was second in 1983, 9th in the league in 84, and 3rd in this season. We're talking about 1985. He also played all 82 games in this season. Very unfortunately, the rest of his career was hampered by a life-threatening meningitis, which was referred to as desert fever. I've subsequently learned that he only played 5 games in the 88 season and then played scattered games throughout the previous years from that diagnosis. He also played in Mexico in the 89 season before returning to the NBA in 1990, where he played 53 games again with the San Antonio Spurs.
I remember his NBA trading card from the 1990 season when he came back to play with the Spurs, but I wasn't aware of the fact that he led the NBA in assists.
No, neither. It's a fantastic stat. He is right up there in terms of all-time assist leaders with the franchise. So a player who obviously flew under the radar because I wasn't aware of his exploits until researching for this episode. It's worth mentioning as well, mate, it's quite difficult to keep up with the Joneses in this episode. We've got the brothers Charles and Caldwell on the Chicago roster at this stage. And San Antonio also had an interesting guy. What I kept saying interesting. San Antonio had a gentleman that we'll be talking about a little bit in this game. His name is Ozell Jones. And they also had another Jones named Edgar who did not play.
We mentioned in a previous episode that this was camera night. Fans were invited to bring along their cameras and also a pen to get autographs of the Chicago Bulls players. In the introductions for the game, there was a really big cheer for Artis Gilmore as he was announced for San Antonio. Also mixed in with some boos that were undoubtedly directed at Dave Corzine for his part in Gilmore being traded to San Antonio.
I've really developed a strong liking for Dave Corzine over the course of this NB85 series. I already did enjoy his play, particularly in the 89 season, back when I sort of first was exposed to who he was as a player at that time when I started to catch up on the history of the game. But yeah, I've really come to love the fact that Dave Corzine's the underdog of all underdogs as far as the Bulls players go.
I'm well aware of the fact that you're a big Dave Corzine fan, and I'll elaborate on that a bit later on.
Okay.
It was very strange seeing, and I put it in inverted commas, 6'2" from Notre Dame John Paxson being introduced for the opposition team.
As well as not hearing it introduced by the dulcet tones of Ray Clay, who incidentally is a former podcast guest. Shameless self-promotion.
Jake O'Donnell and Blaine Reichelt were the officials on this game. MJ's first score of the game was a fast break, double pump and one layup, which drew the first Captain Marvel name from Johnny Kerr. Michael Jordan mentioned this nickname somewhat recently in an interview with Ahmad Rashad and said that he's glad that it didn't stick, as are we.
Yeah, like as much as we love Johnny Red Kerr, this is a name that I'm glad certainly didn't stay around for the majority of MJ's career. Although Johnny certainly gave it a fair working over in this game. Yeah. He said Captain Marvel probably 5 or more times that I can recall.
Yeah, and he also mentioned it in other games as well, so he gave it every opportunity.
He did, and the Ray Clay episode, for what it's worth, inallairness.com/9, and you'll be able to hear a great conversation with the legendary announcer for the Bulls, Ray Clay.
The broadcasting TV station on this game was, again, Sports Vision, and after a little bit of research, I have discovered that in 2014, what was Sports Vision in 1984 is actually now a Comcast Sports channel in Chicago who currently broadcast Chicago Bulls games.
There you go, mate. You learn something new every time.
I saw the Sports Vision logo and I thought it looked exactly the same, really, as the old Sports Channel logo, and Sports Vision eventually became Sports Channel, which eventually became Comcast.
Good stuff, mate.
George Gervin's first basket came after a pass from Gene Banks when he was camped under the basket for what seemed like an eternity. Now, I'm not sure if I'm more upset that a 3-second call wasn't made or the fact that the Bulls left him wide open for so long.
Possibly both.
The young Bulls got out on the break a lot, which I'm sure is what helped contribute to their 114 points per game average up to this point, to which Bill Hazen said that they have their track shoes on today after first quarter fast break. And Adam, fear not, I didn't give you a full Bill Hazen impersonation on that one. The impersonation is coming.
You're going to reserve it for when it really needs to be used.
On the next play, MJ drove past George Gervin like he was standing in cement on a drive to the hoop and a layup. And I'm quite a fan of that term, standing in cement. I heard it used once when Akeem Olajuwon blew past Luke Longley. Will passed Langley like he was standing in cement.
Yeah, I know.
Up next, George Gervin hit his first of approximately 49 finger rolls in this game with a ripper from about 6 feet from the hoop that he arced over an outstretched defender. His very next basket was an offensive board and, yes, a finger roll.
I've made mention in my notes as well that he hit on countless finger rolls, and they were so beautiful to watch. I know he's known for his finger roll, particularly, George Gervin, and we'll get to those a bit later in the game also.
It was definitely his trademark shot, and he was clearly just that good at it and that confident with it that he used it at times when just like a simple push shot up towards a hoop would have sufficed, but he was obviously that confident with it that he pulled it out at every given opportunity.
It led to a great comment from Bill Hazen. At one stage, Gervin used the backboard to his advantage, and Hazen then said, he has so much English on the ball, you'd swear he's a professor, which I found to be a fantastic line.
John Paxson of the San Antonio Spurs and his 1984 Movember attempt checked in with just under a minute to go. As you mentioned before, Adam, it was during the following off-season that Pax would become a Chicago Bull. The Spurs owed the Bulls money, so new GM Jerry Krause told them to, and I quote, give me Paxson to wipe that debt away.
Nice one. To end this first quarter, mate, the aforementioned, between us we use that word at least 3 times an episode, the aforementioned Dave Corzine connected on a 3-quarter court pass to MJ, who hit a 3-pointer as the first quarter drew to a close, which gave the Bulls a 32-30 lead after 1.
MJ got the second period off to a good start with his first dunk of the game. It came off a steal at half court and a soaring two-handed double clutch throwdown, no less. A great piece of commentary come up from Johnny Kerr on the ensuing play. MJ was fouled on a jump shot, and during the ensuing replay, Red Kerr describes Mike as jumping in the air, then he hangs, then gets a shut off.
So, he could hang?
He could hang.
Good stuff there from Johnny. Oh dear. Keep going, mate.
There were a lot of black holes down low for both teams. Once the ball went into the post, no one was looking for the kick out and often jacked up shots against a double team.
Always a high percentage play. At this stage, the Spurs were up by 9 points. It was 48-39. There was about 5 minutes left in the half, and a very exciting stretch of plays would follow. And I think you're about to detail some of those that happened, mate.
Yes, a Jordan 17-foot jump shot was immediately followed by an Orlando dunk on the aforementioned Spurs rookie Ozell Jones. Luckily for Orlando, he landed on the floor because it was either this or land on Ozell.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Ozell a little bit. He had quite a surprising game. His influence on the scoring column was minimal, but he certainly did enough to suggest that he could have been a very handy player in the league for many years. Are you of that same opinion from what you saw of the game? I thought he looked like he was quite impressive and had the potential and had the build to be a force for the Spurs going forward, but I don't think his career ultimately ended up reaching the heights, I guess, that he obviously would have hoped for.
He did seem very athletic and long, and I've got to say he ran with a very Sam Bowie-esque gait as he went up the court.
Good reference there.
The Orlando Warriors dunk on Ozell Jones was then also followed up by an MJ one-hander on Ozell Jones. MJ scored his 15th point with 2 minutes and 30 seconds remaining off a lob from Ennis Watley. And then on the other end, he blocked John Paxson at the rim. With 1:05 remaining, George Gervin hits on a ridiculous finger roll from about 5 feet out that went 6 feet up in the air.
That's the play I'm referring to where it was just a stunning move, and I rewound it and watched it 2 or 3 times at least. Jordan had 20 points in the first half, and the Spurs, though, still held on to a 58-54 lead at the half.
Just to mix it up, George Gervin started the third quarter with, yes, a finger roll. Next Spurs possession, Gervin scored on a 3-point play on also a finger roll.
He was definitely on a roll.
It was a pun I was going to use myself, but
I couldn't help it, sorry.
Then on the very next offensive play for San Antonio. MJ was defending Gervin, who got to the hoop and rebounded his own miss for another score. San Antonio went 16 for 17 on free throws in the first half and had the Bulls in the penalty at the 7:36 mark of the third quarter, which was very early on.
At this point, I've added in my notes that the veteran savvy continued to give the Spurs the upper hand, and they held on to a 9-point lead. It was 69-60, and the Bulls called for time.
It was during this third quarter that on the broadcast, Johnny Kerr sent his best wishes to Jack Madden, the highly regarded referee who had recently had knee surgery. Jack Madden is quoted as saying that the biggest whiners were some of the greatest players. Oscar Robertson and Rick Barry were some of the biggest babies that cried about everything, but they are Hall of Famers. He also said Jordan was also up there on the list of whiners, but he's the greatest player of all time. Now, an early memory that I have of Jack Madden is from the Portland Trailblazers at Chicago Bulls game from late in 1992, which you would have seen, Adam. The Blazers were in town without Jerome Kersey and Clyde Drexler, and eventually went down in a fairly close game. At one point during the game, Jack Madden called MJ for a travel in the second half, and the camera shot went up to a guy in the crowd who waved his hands at Madden and gave us a very easy-to-lip read, "That's BS." This was that game where MJ dunked back a Scottie Pippen missed free throw.
Great stuff. Now, Blaine Reichelt, the referee, is clearly not on Red Kerr's Christmas card list because he backhandedly sort of says that Blaine is not one of his favourites and then goes on to talk about Jack Madden. So I also had something similar noted down as well, mate. Quite amusing.
It was after this that MJ came off the screen, hangs in the air, legs in full Jumpman pose, and again hung, and scored on the M1 jumper from 14 feet.
That was a crazy shot too, wasn't it? Like incredible skill to control his body enough to then get the shot off and even get close to hitting the rim, and then he actually made the shot.
It was then that MJ picked up points 26 and 27 on a 17-foot pull-up on Johnny Moore.
I think in episode 10, we went with a featured image on the blog post, which was MJ hitting a shot over Johnny Moore. Can't recall if it was this actual play, but it's a really cool photo, and I must thank you for being able to source many of the great images we've actually used throughout the NB85 series and the In All Anders podcast as well, mate.
My life is nothing if not life in the fast lane, and I do spend a stupid amount of time on Google Images searching for images for this podcast.
Yeah, I can even up that one further, mate, by saying that I trawl through Google newspaper searches for probably an inordinate amount of time, much to my lovely wife's chagrin.
Nice use of the word chagrin.
Yes, very nice. The 1985 version of who would be Horace Grant, Steve Johnson, as you mentioned in a previous episode, blocked a Gene Banks scoring attempt on an alley-oop, which was a very great play to see. It's a play that you don't often see. The pass had been completed, but the actual catch and put in the basket did not happen. So that was a good move by Steve Johnson.
Yeah, on the odd occasion that you do see it, it's really good anticipation, isn't it, by the defensive player?
Yeah, wonderful.
And next up was the play of the game. And in my personal top 5 MJ plays of his entire career, Mike Mitchell for the San Antonio Spurs misses a jumper. MJ grabs the rebound and goes from 0 to 100 in 1.5 seconds. And at full speed, it navigates around the Spurs in front of him and finishes with a flying jam. The crowd were still on their feet a minute later after the ensuing Spurs timeout. Attached to this jam of Jordan's in the San Antonio game was a piece of commentary by Bill Hazen, which suited it just perfectly. And it goes a little something like this. Bulls can cut it to 1 if they score. Here's Jordan in the middle all the way.
Yeah, that's great. The crowd went absolutely bonkers. He's so fired up. I guess the adrenaline's flowing. He's such an incredible athlete. All those sort of things combine to make him just that freakish 1 in a billion athlete.
It was an unconfirmed report that the length that MJ jumped on that dunk would have actually won bronze at the 84 Olympics in LA. Yeah.
And imagine Carl Lewis could have actually been on the bench for the Bulls.
He could have been.
And he actually earned a spot on the roster after being drafted by Chicago. We could have a full episode of the In All Anders podcast just chatting about MJ's greatest plays, and probably we will in a future episode. I noted as well on that play that it took Jordan just 5 dribbles from the time he got the defensive rebound to making that one-hand power jam.
He took, I think, either 2 or 3 of those dribbles in the backcourt, and it was at about half court where he just put the Jets on and then took 1 or 2 more dribbles and then came third in the Olympic long jumping event.
Oh my goodness. The Lawnmower Man is back. Talk about bad timing. Anyhow, we might try and get him to sponsor the show, I guess, if he's going to keep turning up every time we record. I think it was on the next play. Shortly after, Dave Corzine forced Artis Gilmore to travel and fall out of bounds on the baseline. And for no apparent reason, I've just noted down that it was one of my favourite random plays ever. The crowd were absolutely in hysterics at this stage. Following on from this jam, the crowd going berserk, but it was just awesome to see. And I just loved watching Corzine cause Gilmore to do the turnover.
Definitely worth noting because Dave actually played lockdown defense on Artis on this particular play to force him into a travel. And again, it was an unconfirmed report that after this brilliant play on Gilmore that Dave Corzine actually considered retirement.
He could have considered retirement in that game against the Knicks that we chatted about in a previous episode too, after he hit 4 consecutive shots.
And with 1:54 left in the third quarter, MJ checked out to a massive ovation from the crowd and 29 points to this point.
So we thought he'd done pretty well in the first 3 quarters, but he had one of the greatest fourth quarters of his career, and we'll get to that very shortly. The Spurs still hung on to a 3-point lead. It was 89-86 after the third quarter. Just before we get into the fourth quarter discussion, mate, newspaper articles suggest that MJ hit 7 straight shots in the fourth quarter. Now, because I'm such a nerd, I charted his shots, and he actually missed 1 in amongst his stretch. I'm not entirely sure who was right, either the newspaper articles or myself. But anyhow, I thought it was just worth mentioning that that was the case.
I think that you know that it's you that's right.
Quite possibly. I did see it. I watched it happen. I charted them all. He missed 1 in amongst these other 7 that were made. So make of that what you will.
Now, into fourth quarter action, MJ brought up his 33rd point by torching Gene Banks whilst getting to the hoop. George Gervin then put the Spurs up 102-100 on a finger roll, which gave him 28 points.
What a surprise that was. Finger roll.
Then there was an MJ 17-footer. Then MJ, on the next play, got Johnny Moore into the air on a fake, threw a jab step, followed by a spin and another jump shot that gave him a new career high of 39 points.
And that surpassed his previous high of 37, which was against the Milwaukee Bucks in his second home game.
That is correct.
Commentators made mention of how loud the crowd was at Chicago Stadium and that they're looking forward to getting a full house at the Madhouse on Madison. On the next possession, MJ ran off a curl, took a pass from Quinton Daly and hit an 18-footer to put the Bulls up 111-110, and MJ had just scored 10 points in the span of 1:40 at this point.
That's a fantastic run.
With 1:48 remaining in the fourth quarter, Orlando Woolridge hit a big basket. He started this game off quite slowly but finished strong with 20 points, and he put the Bulls up 3. With 1:34 remaining, San Antonio took a timeout. During my notes, I've said Suns timeout on more than one occasion. Cotton Fitzsimmons was a guy that I first knew as Phoenix's head coach, so I've written down Suns timeout instead of a Spurs timeout. I guess you could say it took me a little while to cotton on.
Hey, good one.
Then off a jump ball between Steve Johnson and Gene Banks. Banks actually won the tip, but MJ stole the ball and went end-to-end for a floating one-hand layup to give him 43 points. And the Chicago Stadium crowd was losing their freaking mind at this point as Chicago took a 5-point lead with 49 ticks left on the clock.
And MJ was already showing how savvy of a player he was, because just prior to that jump ball taking place, he was manoeuvring for position on the jump ball so he could gain the tip. He even gave one of his stock standard little pats on the backside to the referee just prior to when the jump ball happened, because he was trying to jockey for a position. So he was already using his smarts, which would obviously show throughout his entire career.
Then late in the game, MJ was fouled by fellow rookie and US Olympian Alvin Robertson, who actually saw very little action in this game. The ensuing 2 free throws gave him points numbers 44 and 45.
A fantastic game. The final score was 120 to 117. The Bulls were victors. They outscored San Antonio 34 to 28 in the fourth quarter, took their record to 7-2. It was the Bulls' 4th consecutive win. However, it is worth noting that they would go on to lose 7 of their next 8, and we'll detail those games in episode 12 of this series. For Chicago, Jordan had 16 points in that fourth quarter, ended up with 45 for the game. He had 10 boards and 4 assists in the process. Orlando Woolridge had 20 points of his own. For San Antonio, George the Iceman Gervin had 28 points. Mike Mitchell had 23 points. We didn't really make mention of the fact that he scored that many for San Antonio, but that's worth noting as well. And Artis Gilmore had 19 points.
Mike Mitchell is another one of those guys who played in the 80s that doesn't really get much airtime now, but obviously he was a more than decent scorer.
Jordan's 45 points were the most by a Chicago Bulls player since Reggie Theus's 46 points at Boston in December of 1982. This was only the Bulls' second victory versus San Antonio in the previous 15 meetings. In an article entitled, "It's Jordan Early, Late," George Gervin is quoted as saying, "The people here better start buying their tickets because there aren't going to be many left if he," referring to Jordan, "keeps playing this way." Then Artis Gilmore went on to say, "The Bulls are much more exciting now than when I was here," which is quite telling. And a little note to end one of the articles that I found in researching for this episode. In terms of MJ's star status, the Reverend Jesse Jackson met with Michael Jordan after the game. So you could see clearly that Jordan was already almost transcendent in terms of his star appeal and other celebrities actually wanting to even be associated with him at that time.
I read an article today that early on in his career, at one point in time in Chicago, that an Arabian prince was in town and wanted to meet up with Jordan, and Jordan's star was that big at that particular time that he actually had to knock him back. And Tim Hallam, the Chicago Bulls media man, said that there's an Arabian prince in every town.
I guess there must be an array.
Adam, stop right there. This joke can only end badly. Philadelphia versus Chicago, November 17th, 1984.
Now, this time the crowd was a very healthy, standing room only type proportion, 18,116. So fantastic to see the stadium almost chock full. And at this time, the Bulls were 7-4 for the season. As I mentioned previously, they lost 7 of their next 8 games following the Spurs contest. 76ers were led by coach Billy Cunningham. And this time around, the TV coverage is from the 76ers network. It was Neil Funk, who is obviously closely associated with the Chicago Bulls, given his incredible... Is servitude even a word? I think it may be. His servitude to the Bulls franchise over the years. And Doug Collins, former Philadelphia 76ers player, 4-time All-Star with Philadelphia. He only played his last NBA game in the 1980-81 season, and of course would go on to be the Bulls head coach in the late 80s, and just a very famous NBA personality all around. Don't know where I'm going with that. What what am I talking about? Bail me out, please. What do you want to say about Doug Collins?
Doug Collins was early in his broadcast career in this game, but was still as good as what he is today as a colour man. He's by far and away one of my favourite guys to broadcast a game.
Yep, absolutely love hearing Doug Collins on the call, and usually he'll predict plays that are going to happen just based on the fact that he knows the franchises so well and what their key plays are.
During the 1990 and 1991 slam dunk competitions, I'm not sure if you recall this or not, Adam, but Doug Collins must have predicted about half a dozen or 8 of the scores that players got on dunks during the contest. He'd say that, I reckon that's about a 47.2, and lo and behold, the player would get a 47.2 on the dunk. And I can remember Rick Barry saying to Doug after he'd predicted these dunk scores, "You play the lottery often?"
Great recall there. I don't recall that, but I don't doubt it for a second. And Rick Barry, mate, former podcast guest, while I'm at it. You've segued beautifully there. InAllhanders.com/46. Speaking of Doug Collins as well, also in the 1991 three-point shootout, he predicted that as Craig Hodges made even the first or second of his what would be 19 straight, he said, "Put on a show, Craig." He predicted that Hodges would obviously light up the scoring in that three-point shootout, which of course he did when he hit 19 straight shots.
And he mentioned also about how Craig Hodges' shooting ability actually made a lot of the other Bulls players better shooters because his teammates would challenge him during practices to other shooting competitions. So he lifted the bar a little bit on Chicago Bulls outside shooting during his tenure there.
The Bulls were coming off a very disheartening 20-point loss to the Boston Celtics, and we did cover that in episode 10 of this series. So that was 2 days prior. Charles Barkley was coming off the bench for Philly early in his rookie season, which was quite interesting to note. He actually would end up starting in 60 games for the season, but his effect in this game was quite minimal, although he did have one fantastic play, which we'll talk about during this game. This was also David Greenwood's first game of the season for the Bulls. Now, he was supposed to bolster the Bulls' front line and help with their rebounding prowess. However, in this particular game, that was sorely lacking across the board. For the Sixers, Andrew Toney was out with a sprained ankle. Clint Richardson played in his place. And a little tidbit, for no apparent reason, Julius Erving and Michael Jordan met for the first time before the game.
Just on that little tidbit there that they met for the first time before this game, is that photo that you see of MJ wearing his jersey, but also his warm-up pants, standing next to Julius Erving? Is that perhaps that first meeting before this game?
It could very well be. I know that it's in one of the articles that I found when we were doing the research for this episode, and I just don't know if it was pre-game on the court or they met in the change rooms beforehand, whatever it may have been. But there's also a great quote that I'll mention at the end of this game that we're chatting about, which Dr. J says about what they actually said to each other when they first met.
Onto the game. As you mentioned before, a very young and grey-haired Neil Funk, which makes no sense whatsoever.
It's accurate, though.
Yeah. Considering what Neil Funk looks like now, was on the call of the game along with Doug Collins for WPHL TV in Philadelphia. This was apparently the first game that Jordan wore the Air Jordan 1 in his rookie season, although this is still unconfirmed up to this point. We had Caldwell Jones and Moses Malone on the tip. Before the game, Doug Collins made mention that Julius is cranked up for this game.
It's clearly obvious that is the case as well, because numerous instances throughout this game, Julius was absolutely amped, and you could see that he was really exerting himself to try and do what he could to minimise the impact that Jordan would have in the contest.
At the age of 29, Moses Malone was really at the peak of his powers in this game and had 39 and 19. Even though he was 29, he still had that 40-year-old Moses shuffle as he ran down the court.
I just couldn't believe how great of a player he was. Fans of the NBA who might not, be particularly well versed in the history of how great an impact players had earlier in their career, they might remember Moses where he's on the Hawks roster or whatever it may have been, playing for the Bucks or whoever. But he was just absolutely fantastic, and in this game was just ridiculous with how great he played. And he was having a fantastic stretch of games in this first couple of weeks of the season, which we alluded to in a previous episode of the series, and we probably will again in future episodes too, no doubt.
He was, of course, a big man, but you could see during this game just a snapshot of just how physical he was down low, and he just must have been a real handful for anyone that he played on, which just so happened to be Caldwell Jones, who I give a lot of credit to. He was 34 at this point of this game and really wasn't adverse to getting on his skates in transition and had a nice open court dunk early in the game.
Yeah, I don't blame him for not getting on his skates. That'd be terribly dangerous on the Chicago Stadium floor.
I mentioned Jordan's Air Jordan 1 sneaker before. Neil Funk made the comment that Jordan with possibly the ugliest shoes in the league, and later said that he looked like he'd painted them himself.
Later on in the game, they do actually show a very good close-up of the shoes, and I reckon they look fantastic, to be honest, but I guess didn't please everybody at that time.
It was clearly one of the first games, if not the first game that he played in the shoe, because as you mentioned before, they had several close-ups of it. So it was obviously a point of interest for the game.
Definitely.
The Bulls got off to a great start in this game and were up 15-8 at one point in time in the first quarter, 11 of which were scored by Orlando Woolridge. With 7:51 remaining, 76ers rotundity rookie Charles Barkley checked in, and I know that rotundity doesn't fit there, but I love the word, wanted to get it in there.
I think we mentioned that in one of the early episodes of the series, mate.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Halfway through the first quarter, the score was 20-12 Chicago, and shortly after, the crowd gave, and I put in inverted commas, saviour David Greenwood a nice ovation as he checked in for his first game.
Yeah, one of the glaring things that we both noticed during this contest is the fact that the Bulls were just terrible on the boards.
One of MJ's first field goal attempts in the game was a baseline drive and a one-handed dunk that Moses blocked him on.
You know what would be cool? If somebody had the foresight to actually go through all the footage that exists of Jordan and actually put together either his missed dunks, his attempts where he's driven hard to the hoop and gets blocked, or just things like that. I reckon that'd be fascinating to watch.
Fascinating, yeah, it would be. Up until the 98 season, I swore that MJ had never been blocked on a dunk attempt. Now, obviously, I've seen a lot more footage in between 1998 and now, but as a Jordan defender, I would have defended him until the cows come home that he'd never been blocked on a dunk attempt. And you remember in 1998 when little-known David Vaughan destroyed MJ at the hoop. MJ went up on David Vaughan for a one-handed dunk and Vaughan just swatted him cleanly. Remember that?
Yeah, I do. There's a couple of moments like that, but also a famous moment that occurred only because of the fact that Jordan got blocked in the... Oh, now I'm testing myself. I think it was December 1988. Anyhow, it was the Knicks at Bulls. It was in the final seconds of a game there, and Jordan drove in and went to jam over Patrick Ewing and got rejected. The ball spilt back to Scottie Pippen, a young Scottie Pippen, who gathered the ball near the free throw line, hit a running one-hander at the buzzer, and the Bulls were victors. That only came on the back of the fact that Jordan was rejected at the hoop on a throwdown.
The newly released NBA encyclopedia, everyone.
I happen to remember certain games and dates, but I might be off on that one. Keep going, mate.
Saviour David Greenwood's first touch in the game was the Spalding hitting him in the head on a cross-court pass from Jordan to Whiteley that ended in a turnover and a Mocheek score. So the Saviour was off to a great start.
Love it.
MJ's first score in the game was off a turnover that ended in a 2-on-1 break and a floating layup. I mentioned before that Moses looked really imposing inside for Philly. You could see how he piled up the numbers that he did. He was really, really physical down low. The Bulls started the game 11 for 14 from the field, so they started the game off very, very well. Speaking of field goal attempts, Quinton Daly checked in with a missed jumper. His first 4 touches of the ball were all missed field goal attempts. Doug Collins even mentioned that he's just taken 4 shots in the space of a minute.
Oh, I love that. I absolutely love it. He was never afraid to jack up shots. Like, he was the Russell Westbrook of 84-85. Obviously not nearly as athletic and game-breaking, however, could jack up shots with reckless abandon and not even break a sweat.
It really was the quintessential gunner.
Oh, you come out with these puns on a daily basis. Well played.
In the newest installment of the Dave Corzine Boo Vultures, Doug Collins actually mentioned during the game that Dave Corzine was 3 for 17 from the field at home, which shows why the Boo Birds were on him so hard, but also showed his clear struggles compared to playing on the road. Doug Collins also spoke about his struggles with Chicago Bulls fans and how a situation like that can be a real nightmare for a player. MJ also checked back into the game late in the first quarter.
After one quarter, the scores were tied, 32 apiece. And into the second quarter, Charles Barkley opened with a vicious lefty jam around Jordan. He faked baseline, which gave him room to drive to the hoop, and that was his only score of the game. So that was quite remarkable. I think Barkley only played 14 minutes for the game. Now, Moses Malone, we've already talked about the great game that he had. He was an absolute machine. He averaged 24 points and 15 rebounds a game in his NBA career in the 8 seasons leading up to this season. He was already a 3-time NBA MVP and an NBA champion in the 83 season, where he was also the MVP of the finals too. So to say he was dominant would be understating things. MJ's second field goal came well into this second quarter. And I also wanted to make note that Sadal Threet, of course, former podcast guest, played 22 minutes in this game. He scored on some very key buckets for the 76ers, and Doug Collins said as much later in this contest as well. Sadal finished with 10 points on 5 of 8 shooting. One of his buckets in this quarter led to a Bulls timeout, and following that, he also scored on a great fast break dunk. And then Neil Funk said that it was Sadal's third jam of the season, for what it's worth. MJ fouled him for the 3-point play opportunity. Sadal was on episode 12 in allearness.com/12.
One of my least favourite stats that's kept in 2014 is the amount of dunks that a player has in any given season. And it appeared as though Neil Funk actually started the trend back in 1984.
He very well could have, because, I'm tired of Dwight Howard has 615 dunks. He's also annoyed 4,255 fans. Anyhow, moving on. Now, also, mate, because Jordan was quiet in this game offensively in the first half, he was really for the whole game. He struggled from the field. That led to an increased scoring load for other Chicago Bulls, and in this particular game, Orlando Woolridge, which was good to see. Doug Collins and Neil Funk, they both talked about Dr. J's preparedness for this game, as we alluded to a little bit earlier. He was out pre-game shooting and warming up with the rookies, which backs up the fact that Doug Collins said how cranked Dr. J was for this game. So that was good to note. MJ only took 7 field goal attempts in the first half. Now, Orlando Woolridge had 19 points up until half-time. Moses had 16 points for the 76ers, and they would hold on to a 6-point lead. It was 54-48 at the half.
One of the more noticeable trends that developed during the third quarter in particular, but it happened right across the game, was that the Bulls were getting absolutely hammered on the boards by the much bigger 76ers. Going into the third quarter, the Bulls continued to struggle to grab a defensive rebound. It was at this point where mass confusion reigned supreme in my lounge room after the following exchange between Doug Collins and Neil Funk. Collins asks, "Who is Orlando Woolridge's uncle?" To which Funk answered, "Willis Reed." Now, Adam, is Willis Reed Orlando's cousin or his uncle? Because in the previous time we've talked about this, in the first game of the season, it was mentioned that he was his cousin.
I thought it was his cousin, but were we misinformed by the New York Knicks commentators? Or, because, there's obviously an age difference between Willis Reed and Orlando Woolridge, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't be cousins. But you'd think perhaps it actually might be an uncle. Welcome to the In All Genealogy podcast. I'm not sure exactly what they were on about. Who was right? Yeah, no wonder there was mass confusion. I'm confused right now.
We bring you the NB85 podcast, as well as the opportunity, if you would like to find out more information about your family history, you can contact the podcast via inallairness.com.
Brought to you by genealogy.com.
There was an early timeout for the Bulls in the third quarter, as they were down 58-48 after 2 Bobby Jones free throws. Doug Collins says that the Bulls really, at this point...
Doug Collins or Dog? I thought you said Doug Collins.
At this point of the third quarter, with the Sixers starting to pull away, Doug Collins said that the Bulls need to get MJ more involved on the offensive end. But the whole team, and even Mike, were having a lot of trouble just getting the ball to drop.
I've distracted myself, and I'm actually picturing
Doug Collins.
Someone dressed in a suit and tie on the sidelines. That was actually a dog coaching the Bulls. Oh, my goodness. And yeah, obviously I didn't sleep too well last night. Now, Philadelphia had a 12-2 scoring run to open the third quarter.
In one of the more startling plays of the game, Caldwell Jones gets the ball stripped from him out high by Moses, who then dribbled the ball end-to-end for a layup and a 12-point 76ers lead and a subsequent Bulls timeout. This play by Moses was really where the rot set in for Chicago, because out of that timeout, Jordan had the ball stolen by Bobby Jones, who took it to the other end for a dunk.
I must say, on the topic of Bobby Jones and dunks, he could throw down some absolute hammers, particularly earlier in his NBA career, like I'm talking the early 80s. He was throwing down some monster dunks, and there's one in particular against the Celtics. I think it was at Philadelphia, circa 1983, 82. He just threw down an absolute hammer in a playoff game, which was one of the most crazy dunks I've ever seen, and yet you barely even see it replayed these days.
Yeah, I know the exact dunk that you're speaking of. I reckon he dunked it over at least 2 or 3 Celtics.
Oh, my goodness. I think it was going to the right of screen, and boy, it was so pretty to watch.
The quintessential gunner, Quinton Daly, checked in and immediately missed a jumper. Not the best set play for a team down 14 and struggling to score the ball. An easy alley-oop layup to Julius Erving put the Sixers up by 16, and it was all coming far too easy for the 76ers at this point. MJ made a nice play by deflecting a Moses Malone baseline fadeaway. He gathered the loose ball and took it to the other end to feed Orlando for a dunk. Halfway through the quarter, the Bulls started to hand the ball to MJ at the top to orchestrate the offense. However, the shot selection, particularly 2 woeful shots by Woolridge and Daly, was very poor from the Bulls in this quarter. And on the subsequent play, MJ even missed on a fast break score to show you how much they were struggling. The Sixers were answering these poor shots with scores in transition and thus repeated 4-point swings.
That is Doug Collins-esque analysis there. Well played. I like it.
All of this play ended in a 20-8 run by Philadelphia to start the third quarter. MJ's third field goal made of the game was an 18-footer off the curl.
Philadelphia were up 20, 82-62, with just over 2 minutes left in the third quarter.
Charles Barkley, unlike his eating habits of the time, was very passive on the offensive end, which was quite strange to see from Charles. In one sequence, he picks up his dribble and gets himself stuck at the top of the foul line, which leads to a Wes Matthews steal and score. The next possession, he airballs a really tough 17-footer. Then at the other end, blocks a Quinton Daly shot in the lane quite spectacularly at the apex of its arc, and then fouls Corzine on a 3-point play. The 3-point play brought the lead back to 11 off 2 baskets by Woolridge and the Corzine 3-point play. He had a really good rookie season, but Chuck looked all at sea at times in this game. Now, it may have been what Doug Collins said previously about Dave Corzine's struggles at home, but I think you'd agree, Adam, that he looked very tentative on court during this game.
Yep, totally agree. And the fact that they mentioned his previous struggles, particularly at home, also just emphasised that fact because he continued on in this particular contest. After 3 quarters, the Sixers still were in a commanding position. It was 84-71. And into the fourth quarter, in a promo for an upcoming Sixers versus Blazers game, Doug Collins' script had him suggest that Sam Bowie was and I've got inverted commas here, rookie sensation. Now, after hearing that, I was quite startled, so I went to the greatbasketballreference.com website and checked Bowie's stats to that point. His averages were, after 10 games in his rookie season, 5.8 points on 49% field goal shooting. Top that off by the fact that Bowie, hello to David Bowie, Bowie was injured at this stage, having actually missed 2 of what would be 5 straight games. So a slight overreaction there to say that he was a rookie sensation.
I mentioned earlier on that Doug Collins is one of my favourite colour guys to listen to during a game, but that rookie sensation call on Sam Bowie was under good consideration for the questionable comments Hall of Fame.
I think, in fairness to Doug, I think he was actually reading a script because it sounded like he wasn't overly convinced by what he was saying in the first instance.
He was also doing advertisements during this game for a gas station chain.
Yeah, he was too. There was a bit of that going on. Dave Corzine made 2 free throws, and then Funk said, for the first time this evening, Dave was actually rewarded by something other than booze. So again, it continues the fact that Corzine was a perennial whipping boy, which I'm not overly a fan of, to be honest. Another great point from Doug Collins. He said that with MJ struggling from the field, that he should just drive to the hoop and create at the rim, which sounds easy as far as an analyst would suggest, but it made perfect sense. Jordan was really struggling. I think he was 4 for 17 for the game when we get to the final stats, but he just didn't drive into the hoop and actually try and make something happen. So that was a good comment there from Doug. And also, we've gone way too long without mentioning this gentleman's name. Doug Collins references Kelly Tripucka.
Yes!
Being shut out in a game versus the 76ers the night prior after he went for 40 plus in a previous meeting with Philly. And he likens that to MJ's 45 points versus the Spurs, which we just talked about, and then him being shut down by the Celtics and 76ers in consecutive games.
It's an unconfirmed report that exact comment was actually what got Doug Collins fired from his post as head coach of Chicago after the 89 season.
Shortly after, Jordan is guarding Dr. J on a play at the top of the key, one-on-one. Now, not sure he meant it or not, but Irving banked it home, and you could just see that it was one of those nights for MJ. With 4:30 remaining in the fourth quarter, the 76ers were up 13 points. It was 98-85. And then the Bulls went on a bit of a tear. They outscored Philly 10-2 towards the end of this quarter. They got to within 5 points. It was 100-95 with just over 1 minute remaining. But the Bulls simply ran out of time, and the 76ers held on to the win. In the closing moments of the game, there was a discussion between Neil Funk and Doug Collins spanking babies, which quite disturbing at best, I must say. And in fact, so disturbing I might edit that part out. You look quite worried at that end of the Skype call, mate.
No. That's worth keeping in there.
Do you know what I'm referring to? Like, they were talking about the fact that I think the Bulls were taught a bit of a lesson, and I can't remember the exact way it was meant, but Collins was referring to the fact that occasionally someone needs to spank their child in order to let them know who's the boss, and it's like the 76ers were doing this to the Chicago Bulls. So some sort of analogy that didn't quite get out as expected. The final score for the game, 76ers were 109-100 winners. The loss dropped Chicago to 7-4 on the season. For the Bulls, Orlando Woolridge had a great game, 33 points. Quinton Central Daly had 24 points. MJ scored 16 on 4 of 17 from the field. However, he did have 5 boards, 7 assists, and 2 blocks, so you can't question his effort to try and make up for his lack of offensive output. For Philly, Moses Malone had a great stat line, absolutely fantastic stat line, 39 points on 12 of 23 from the field. He made 15 of 16 from the line, had 2 blocks as well. Dr. J had 26 points, 8 boards, 4 assists, and 2 blocks, so that's a great stat line to say the absolute least. Mo Cheeks had 12 points, Sadale Threet and Bobby Jones had 10 points apiece, and Sir Charles had just 2 points, 2 rebounds, and a block in 14 minutes of action. Chicago had 28 rebounds as a team. That was an all-time low at that point. Moses Malone had 19 boards himself, and obviously that's why he earned the nickname Chairman of the Boards many years prior. David Greenwood, just for some relevance here, was the NBA's 9th best rebounder in the 84 season. Yet his return to the team obviously didn't help too much on this particular night because they absolutely stunk, to be honest. There's an article which was titled Moses Takes Command, which is a nice little play on words as well. It said, Moses Malone was a man of very few words Saturday night. None, to be exact. He simply held up one hand and shook his head. Moses obeyed the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not speak to reporters, said teammate Julius Dr. J. Irving, which I thought was a pretty cool comment. And Kevin Lockery was quoted as saying, Moses Malone looked like the Moses of the past. He was amazing.
Moses really did make it look like he was playing against a bunch of rec leaguers out there. He really manhandled all of the Bulls' big guys down low in the game.
Certainly did. And as I alluded to earlier, recounting Irving's meeting with Jordan pre-game, Dr. J said, I told him I thought he was taller. He told me he thought I was too. So really, when I'm reading that back, mate, it actually wasn't as great a quote as I actually thought it may have been.
Gripping stuff.
Oh, goodness me. And welcome to In All Insomniacs podcast. Put anyone to sleep, that sort of stuff.
Every time I hear Julius Irving's name, I always think of two things.
Julius, the doctor.
The whirling dervish from the University of Massachusetts. Number 6, captain of the Philadelphia 76ers, Julius the Doctor Erving.
Great stuff.
That actually wasn't it, but there was 3 things, actually. How big Julius's hands were. Everyone always speaks about how big Jordan's hands were, but yeah, the Doc had pretty big mitts on him himself. There was an NBA entertainment video that came out during the 80s called Dr. J's Basketball Stuff.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that he pointed out to any would-be sharpshooters of the game, that the rim is almost the width of 2 basketballs side by side. And I just have that image of the 2 balls sitting on top of the hoop.
I remember that as well. And I even went out into the backyard of my house at that stage and was trying to then give the ball extra arc to try and make more shots. So it actually had an impact on me too.
We also used a size 3 basketball a lot in our, I think I mentioned this before, in our shearing shed. We used a size 3 basketball on a small rim with a court on the floor. We actually, in order to dictate the size of the rim, we actually got 2 size 3 basketballs and sat them together and made the rim just a little bit smaller than the width of the 2 balls. So,
and that's thanks to the good doctor.
Thanks to the good doctor. And the third thing that I think of when I think of Julius is that dunk that he did on Michael Cooper. Well, it wasn't really on Michael Cooper because Cooper had no chance at all, but it was that dunk from the NBA Finals, which everyone knows very well.
Rock the baby to sleep, slam.
Rock the baby to sleep.
Dunk. Yeah. Rest in peace, Chick Hearn. That's 2 more games from Jordan's rookie campaign, mate, that we've just covered there. Anything else that you'd like to add before we do conclude this episode?
Rock the baby to giddy up!
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show and share my web address with your friends and colleagues, inallairness.com. Check out the podcast archive for plenty more episodes with high-profile guests. Follow me on Twitter at inallairness. Please add your like to the show's social hub, facebook.com/inallairness. Join me next time for another edition of the show.